you?
Oh, gracias. Hola, hola a todos. I'm okay. I was just having problems with my headset and I was trying to get a different one, but it works now magically. Who knows? Apologies for everyone for being late.
Nah, don't worry. Just on time. I would like to present you a little bit. And you are a
Sure.
professor in the philosophy department at the University of California at San Diego. And your research has focused in the history of modern philosophy, especially the various forms of idealism, metaphysical, ethical, political, social, and cultural. You have published a lot of papers on Kant and other topics like phenomenology, Hegel, idealism in general. And this time you're going to talk about space, right? The difference between space of intuition and space of experience. So I will let you the microphone so you can present. Do you want to present something in like a
Yes, yeah,
PowerPoint?
if I could share the screen, that would be great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I will give you the role of host. Now you have the power to rule with an iron fist. There you go.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Let's see if I can make this all work. So will this be slideshow and play from the start? Can everyone see that with your screen? Okay, great. Let me also make it so that I can see everyone in the gallery view. Well, thanks everybody for coming, and thank you very much, Carlos, and everyone who's organizing the Congreso. Yeah, so this is, I'll just jump right in. I hope there will be lots of room for discussion, in part also because the material will connect with some of the presentations from the previous sessions. And so if you are wanting to discuss those papers as well, but there wasn't much time, it got cut off, you could please feel free to ask about those with the authors here as well to continue the conversation of the whole Congress, which has been great so far. I've learned a lot already. So yeah, so the presentation is about the question of the meaning of space in Kant's work, and especially the mature work in the critical philosophy. And as you can see from the title, which is already suggestive of a question, I want to explore the possibility that in Kant, there's a sense of space that goes with intuition, and then there might be a different sense of space that would go with experience. And so that frames the whole presentation. But by way of getting into that question posed in that way about the possibility of two senses of space or two kinds of space, I want to set up the discussion a little bit. So let's move into it if we can get into it. So one motivation that I've had for trying to revisit Kant's views on space is, I guess it's somewhat recent, but it's been long-standing now for a while, a criticism of Kant's views, of interpretations of Kant's views, which try to ascribe to Kant an understanding of the term appearance, which would be more phenomenalist in the traditional sense of phenomenalism, where an appearance would be either a mental state or some kind of sensation, quale, or maybe a complex of them in an organized form, but where it would be something subjective and private and not something substantial and objective, intersubjectively available, all those things. And so I myself am drawn to the phenomenalist interpretation of Kant on his doctrine of appearances. And so, but one key question in that whole discussion has to do with the meaning of space. And so that's how that general interpretive debate comes together with the interest of the paper presentation today. In recent work, there are arguments against phenomenalism, the phenomenalist interpretation of Kant on appearances, due to what a lot of people think of as the publicness of space or the objectivity of space in the sense of intersubjective availability or connectedness. And so one recent collection of arguments against phenomenalism, I don't know if you can see this number 2 here, why Kant is not a phenomenalist, this chapter 2, by my wonderful colleague, excellent philosopher, great reader of Kant, Lucy Allais. And so I've been trying to argue with her about it's not as bad as you think, and I don't know that your arguments are totally going to work. But it definitely one of the key issues that we've come back and forth with each other, continuing to center on is, well, okay, what should you say about space if you want to go in this direction? And so even if there are some philosophical motivations for, maybe from someone like Lucy and others, philosophical motivations that people find that they think, well, Kant can't be a phenomenalist about appearances because appearances are in space and space is something public and objective. And so how could appearances themselves be something private, subjective, etc.? That just doesn't seem to make any sense. Kant is a good philosopher, so he can't have that view. That's a short version of the long chapter 2, much more interesting chapter 2 than I'm giving it credit. But that's the basic impulse that we want to bring into the spotlight. And then I want to raise some questions about, well, is that really such a good impulse to have in relation to Kant? Now, one pressure on arguments against phenomenalism, especially in relation to questions about the space of appearances, comes from the historical context in which Kant is writing. So, both on the side of his predecessors and on the side of his successors. And so, here some work, especially by Gary Hatfield, is relevant, looking at Kant's theories, theories of spatial perception from Kant to Helmholtz. But we could also think of work by Michael Friedman, other people working on the neo-Kantians. And here we just want to ask, okay, so in both the pre-Kantians, especially some of those who influenced Kant, and also among the post-Kantians, those people who claim to be influenced by Kant, we find a distinction in the discussion of space between two senses of space or kinds of space, or however you wanted to describe it. This will be a central distinction, trying to figure out what this means and how it might relate to Kant. And so, if you're thinking about people like Spinoza in his work, even though substance has the attribute of extension, Spinoza also introduces the representation of extension by way of the imagination in what he calls space, or the measure of extension. That's represented by imagination, whereas extension is represented by intellect. So too in Leibniz, we can think of the space in the sense of the space that's in perception and turns out to be phenomenal, over and against an order of coexistence among the monads in reality. So the former phenomenal space is distinct from, even though it relates to, the real grounded order of coexistence among monads, which itself might be grounded in the divine understanding or something like that, but it's definitely not really phenomenal. So that's in the pre-Kantians. We have a distinction between something that's in the phenomenal dimension, but spatial in some recognizable sense, over and against some other order of the really existent substances that there are as to their coexistence. Or in Spinoza, it's a special case, there's only one substance, but you get the idea, the order of reality rather than the order of what we might say on Kant's behalf, phenomenality or ideality. Now, among the post-Kantians, it's even easier to point to people, especially we could think of Bertrand Russell in The Problems of Philosophy in 1912, distinction between apparent space, private space on the one hand, and then real space or physical space, or the space of science on the other. A lot of the discussions in the late 1800s, early 1900s have this distinction. And then I'll just mention Carnap, just because his early work from 1922, Der Raum, was published in Kant Studien, and there also distinguishes on behalf of then contemporary science what he calls intuitive space from physical space, where again, the physical space will be the order of reality, and intuitive space will be something given by way of perception immediately, which will be distinct from physical space. And there's, again, in all of these examples, a deep question about, well, how does the one space relate to the other? Is there an intimate connection? Is it accidental? Is it conventional? A lot of interesting questions there. So that's to set the historical context and put pressure on the idea that, even though people leading up to Kant have this kind of distinction, and then even though people after Kant claiming to be influenced by Kant have this kind of distinction, for some reason, Kant himself wouldn't have this distinction. And so one way to put one of the force of the presentation today is to explore this possibility that in Kant as well, there is the presence of such a distinction in his own works, that Kant himself, so here, not just before and after, but possibly in Kant, there will be a distinction between merely phenomenal or perceptual space, and then on the other hand, the space which orders substances themselves as to their coexistence, rather than merely just their appearances, and would form the subject matter of physics or natural science. Okay, so a couple of people who have anticipated this a little bit, Strawson talks about a similar kind of interpretive position in the bounds of sense. Also, Wilfrid Sellars, I didn't have an image of his, the cover of his book, but Wilfrid Sellars in Science and Metaphysics explores a position which is similar in some ways to the one that I want to try to develop today on behalf of Kant. But in both cases, they don't take fully seriously that we could find textual evidence within Kant to justify the interpretation of Kant on these terms themselves. Okay, so is there the possibility of such a distinction in Kant as well? Now, this first distinction that just in the introduction, just to get you thinking about how this could possibly go, one key distinction that we already saw, especially in the session that just finished with Julia's presentation and also Claudia's, the distinction between, in Kant's sense of the term, perception or Wahrnehmung and experience, or Erfahrung, on the other hand. Now, what happens in this distinction? So here's one place among many that he draws this distinction. So here in section 20 of the Prolegomena in English, we are looking at what makes up experience in general, and we see it comes about as a product of the senses on the one hand and the understanding on the other. And then when he characterizes, well, what's contributed from the senses, there is an intuition. But then when we're conscious of the intuition, it becomes a perception. And that all belongs on the side of the senses somehow. And then secondly, something else has to happen, a judging. And then not just any judging, because some judgings just look at perceptions themselves, but a judging that does something that goes all the way down to some universal validity, something objectively valid. And that would finally get us to be experience, or ser experiencia, to finally use some Spanish from the translation that I have on the right. Now here in this distinction between perception and judgments about perception on the one hand, which we can see have only subjective validity and are merely about connections of perceptions in my own mental state without any reference to the object, versus, on the other hand, a judgment of experience where that has a kind of universal validity and has objective validity and is what constitutes it as being about experience. We can see already, you can see where this might be going in anticipation of two kinds of contents for consciousness. One that looks a lot more like the merely phenomenal or perceptual. So a judgment of perception would be a judgment about the kind of object on the top distinction, whereas a judgment in experience would go not express a consciousness of a mental state or something really subjective or a connection among mental states themselves, appearances in that sense, but moves all the way out to the objects and moves to be a judgment about something that could claim to have objective validity. So in this basic distinction, which I know you all know and love and can recite these passages by heart, and you also have lots of questions, of course, we'll talk about those in the question and answer period. In this basic distinction between perception, Wahrnehmung, and Kant's sense, and experience, I want to suggest we have the beginnings of the material for at least posing the possibility that if perception had a distinct object and still had an object which had an ordering, which was recognizably spatial, we should say something different about the spatiality that would be the object of consciousness and perception than we should when we talk about the object, if there is an object in experience, and the ordering that it might have if it has something that has to do with space as well. So that's the first step, just in this introductory presentation of the position. How do we get the interpretation started that would try to keep track of this distinction between kinds of spaces? Now, note also in this section, we have a connection between perception as the consciousness that it is. So it's a consciousness, not just of anything at all, but a consciousness of intuition in particular, intuition in Kant's specific sense of the term. So now here we have not only a distinction between consciousness that goes towards something which is objectively valid and universally valid and has the nature of experience on the one hand, And on the other hand, a consciousness that goes to something which is merely subjective, is something about mental states, and is described as mere perception. But we get a characterization of the subject matter about which the consciousness and perception is of, and it's explicitly named intuition. And so with that further piece of the puzzle, we have opening what I think is a straightforward path to the well-known discussion of space in the Transcendental Aesthetic and elsewhere, which when space is first introduced, it's introduced neither in terms of experience nor even in terms of perception, but in terms of intuition. And so what we need to do then, as we go forward in what follows, will be to first draw out the distinction between perception and experience that we've already anticipated, but relate them both to intuition as itself. That's something distinct from both of them. So that will be to get some of the terminology clarified. Then, of course, we want to move back to the aesthetic and note that the limitation of the discussion of space in the aesthetic is really in terms of intuition and not experience, and not really even in terms of perception. And then what we want to add to that, drawing from section 2, is that when we see perception itself, when we see it characterized, we see it as a consciousness of intuition immediately. And so that just those two sections, section 2 and 3, will give us reason to begin to formulate this alternative perspective on Kant's doctrine of space, according to which the space that is present in intuition, or is the form of intuition, is what is the immediate object of perception itself, or at least it structures the form of the content of perception itself. But once having drawn that connection together, the space in intuition as the immediate object of the consciousness and perception, in section 4, we'll add to that a distinction that we can find as we leave the discussion in the aesthetic and move towards Kant's work from the 1786, the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, where we see Kant talking finally about space in relation to experience more explicitly, and where he then draws a careful distinction, it looks like, between space as we talk about it in relation to experience and space as we have been talking about it in relation to intuition, or as I'm describing it, the consciousness of that intuition in perception. So that will complete, in a way, some of the textual presentation, some of the basic initial textual motivation for going down this path of assigning to Kant two different spaces. I was going to talk also about a still third idea of space, a representation of space or sense of space, one that's done not in intuition or conscious of in perception, on the one hand, also not what is judged about in experience on the second hand, but on the third hand, an idea that comes out of reason, so a third level or about thinking about space, what he calls absolute space. I don't think we'll have time for that, so I'll just note that that would be a still further sense of space. I have done other work on the sense of space in metaphysics and the sense of space in mathematics. If you would like to talk about how those senses of space might factor into these senses, that would be a great question. I'm not going to focus so much on the discussion in the remarks on Abraham Kestner's work, which have recently been translated into English, and Christian Onoff and Dennis Schulting have a paper trying to explain what those distinctions are in that work. I also have a piece where I try to make at least some sense of it. Who knows if that works? So I'll just note that that won't be so much in this paper. That would have been in like a second live also, but I was already running out of time and space. So we'll keep going. In conclusion, though, because of the title of the Congreso, I would like to try to at least sketch how this might inform a revision or at least an alteration in common ways of talking about Kant's idealism having to do with space, by drawing this distinction between the space in intuition and space that we judge about in experience. The space, interpretive space, opens up to assign the ideality to the space of intuition, and then we can ask, what should we say about the space in physical science or the space of experience? Will that be ideal in the very same sense, or will there be something real about it? Should that really be what we call empirically real, is the space of the physical objects themselves? Okay, so that's to anticipate. I hope that both the motivation, the main question, the main distinction, and the plan is clear at this point. And now I will just talk through several texts, just display them and make some remarks about them. And I hope by the presentation of the text alone with some commentary, you will be able to get the basic gist of not just that you could try to read Kant this way, but there is some evidence in the text that you can, in a more invitational way, read Kant this way. And then I will wrap up so that we can have time for discussion. And I know people will have questions and objections and all of that. That would be great to discuss. Okay, so first, just the background distinction between intuition, perception, and experience. I've written about this in other places, so I won't go into too much detail. I feel like in the 90s, the 1990s, and maybe a little bit before, there were a number of people writing about Kant who didn't really keep track of this distinction. Often they were writing about Kant coming from the point of view of contemporary philosophy of mind, where there's a term perceptual experience all put together. And I think in the interpretation of Kant, people often wanted to see that as having the same meaning as intuition, but then they found this other word, perception, and they found a third word, experience, and they thought they all kind of mean roughly the same thing. And so in John McDowell's work, or especially his early work in the 90s, writing about Kant, there's often a kind of running over the distinction between intuition and experience. In work by Colin McClure, Anil Gomez, a lot of good, careful, interesting work. Even Lucy Allays that I was mentioning before, the distinction between intuition and perception is often also run over in debates about the significance of the deduction, how should we read the transcendental deduction. Key passages where Kant doesn't actually use the term intuition, but uses the term perception are read as if he talks about intuition. And so, there's a bunch of reasons for wanting to distinguish these and be careful about them, and a bunch of examples of people not doing it. I just want to give a quick sketch of how you might distinguish these. First, just motivating it. So here in the systematic representation of the principles in the first critique, we can see just in, in this headings, there's one principle that has the name intuition in it, one that has perception in it, and one that has experience in it. And it looks like those should be different topics. Maybe Kant just is using different words to mean the same thing, but he is usually pretty good about not doing that. And he has so many words that he's using. His lexicon is gigantic. Why would he just invent new words to mean the same thing? So just for a first stab at, you need to make this distinction, the reader. Here's a pictorial depiction of them being differentiated. But to have some more content, so how does he describe the distinctions in the text themselves? So here, this is in the A deduction. We can see Kant already early on describing appearance being given, and then when it's combined with consciousness, that will be called perception. So here, over here, and the Spanish as well, keeping track of the terminology. And so the being given an appearance is what happens in intuition. And then if it's combined with consciousness, then it can be called the second thing, which is perception. Here again, this is in the B edition of the deduction. When we have an intuition that is first given, once a synthesis happens, then something else becomes possible, namely perception. So consciousness of the appearance becomes possible. So here again, we have both the distinction between the intuition itself just being there, something else happening. Here it's identified as synthesis of apprehension, and then an output, which is consciousness of the intuition or the appearance that's given in it. And that second thing, this output, is called perception. Okay, so a little bit about the distinction between intuition and perception. Here also just another example. Intuition is there, and then what we have to do is make the intuition into a perception by adding some activity, apprehension, and then again, becoming conscious of it by way of that. So if that's intuition versus perception, perception as the consciousness of intuition itself, what we now want to add to it is the further distinction between intuition, perception, and experience. So experience itself is something that happens here. You can see through not just mere perception, but the representation of perceptions, and not just any representation of perceptions, but the representation of a necessary connection among perceptions. Now, the new word that Kant uses for experience is not just that we have consciousness of an intuition or of some representation or of an appearance, but we have cognition. And what we have cognition of is a cognition that determines an object through perceptions. And so it's not a consciousness of an intuition itself or of an appearance or even of a perception. It's a consciousness that becomes a cognition of an object that goes through perceptions to the object itself. So if that's, again, there's a lot of things we could say about just this terminological differentiation. Some of the distinctions between perception and experience were coming up in the last session. I'll just mention a recent paper by Janum Sethi, who's at Michigan. The paper is in the Journal of Modern Philosophy, which is a relatively new journal, on the judgments of perception versus judgments of experience distinction that I think is very nice and very sharp on a lot of these points. And so hot off the presses, you could take a look at that work if you're interested in that specific debate. Okay, I'm just going to assume that that's enough to get some of the material going. I'll just say in summary again that intuition is the being given of an appearance immediately. Perception is the becoming conscious of the intuition or of the appearance given in it. And then experience is the synthesizing of a bunch of perceptions together, representing their connection as necessary and cognizing or recognizing an object through all of that. And so experience is a very high level thing. It looks like its target is some object that isn't identical with the perception or the intuition or the appearance. It's some object that we become conscious of and try to recognize through a bunch more work, activity by the understanding, etc. Okay, so with that distinction, the sketch of the difference between these terms in hand, now can we go back to the discussion of intuition in the aesthetic and just ask ourselves, so what is he talking about in the aesthetic? Is it space that pertain, space and then what's the other term? Is it the space of the objects of experience? Is it the space that has to do with perception? Or is it space and intuition? Now, you all probably would have answered immediately, just, if we were having a common conversation. Where does Kant talk about space? Well, the aesthetic especially. And what does he talk about it in relation to? Of course, it's one of the most famous parts of the whole book, and it happens right away. And so, of course, everybody's keeping track of the terminology. And one of the most famous arguments in the aesthetic has to do with the standing of the original representation of space as being an intuition rather than a concept. And so, everyone, I think, would agree, okay, intuition is really important. What I want to also invite you to notice is that throughout the text of the aesthetic, the terms perception and experience don't really show up hardly at all. The whole discussion is not just that space relates to intuition, but it also has all these other points too. It really is limited to an argument about the standing of space within intuition in particular. So if we look at the metaphysical exposition in relation to space, the concept of space, maybe you can see with new eyes when experience shows up, it's always as something contrasted with the thing that we're going to talk about. So the first thing, space, is not an empirical concept. It's not drawn from external experiences. As we get to the bottom, the representation of space cannot be drawn from relations of outer experience, out of appearance through experience. Instead, experience itself is only possible through whatever happens with the space representation itself. Notice also that the way he describes it here, it's that certain sensations will be related to something outside me. In order for that ever to happen, maybe that happens in experience. First, what we have to be able to do is to represent them, sensations, as outside and next to each other. And so that also keys us into the form that space is going to provide is an order or a structure in which sensations are being ordered, yes, so that eventually they could be related to something outside me, but in the first instance that they themselves will be outside of one another and next to each other as different and in different places. But now we have a clue as to what's the difference in place amount to. It's difference of places where sensations can be. And so we're already maybe in a different frame of mind than we might have assumed if we thought, oh, it must be about the objects of experience, bodies, etc. So you can note here too that the representation space is a ground. Of course, eventually it makes experience possible, but initially the concern is that it makes intuitions possible. It's the condition of the possibility not only eventually of experience, but already of appearances themselves. And so if we see here the place in which space is introduced, it's of course in relation to intuition, but it's at this very deep level in relation to even intuition itself. As we know from the rest of the passage, space will be described as providing the form of appearances, and itself will be part of the form of intuition. It's something that can itself be intuited in pure intuition. And so, but note throughout what terms are being used: intuition, 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 form of intuition, etc., form of sensibility, and not yet form of experience, or even really hardly anything about perception itself. So the term perception, and like even more so than the term experience, drops out of discussion, or it just is not yet introduced until we get into the discussion in the deductions. Okay, so yeah, here. So I was reading ahead without showing you the text. Space is the form of all appearances of outer sense, the condition under which intuition, is possible for us. Now, what we're talking about is something that precedes even all intuitions. It's given to the mind prior to all actual perceptions. Okay, that's what I wanted. Prior to all experience, etc., etc. So just again, an invitation as you go back and do your nightly reading of the Transcendental Aesthetic. Notice how rare it is to have perception or experience be mentioned as what the subject matter of the discussion really is. It's almost always something that is not yet the subject matter. There's something else we're talking about first, and eventually some later page, maybe around page 100, 200, we'll talk about perception and experience. Okay, so that concludes the very quick tour of the aesthetic. Now, already, before we get into the discussion of the space and experience and the metaphysical foundations, we can draw some temporary conclusions. So first, space is in the presentation within the first critique discussed primarily, firstly, and insistently in relation to something in intuition. Now we know from the previous discussion in section 2 of the presentation that perception is the becoming conscious of intuitions. It's the becoming conscious of the appearances that are given within intuitions. Now, just putting those two things together, it would seem like if there is a consciousness of the space that's given in intuition and the things that are contained within that space, what we should really say is it's a consciousness of sensations being ordered in a certain way, not yet a consciousness of sensations being related to something else. What we need to be able to become conscious of first is the way in which sensations are outside of and next to one another. Now, that, if we remember back, way back to what perception itself is, and way back to the discussion in the Prolegomena, perception is said to be a consciousness exactly of the intuition. And recall here that judgments about what perception contains really are just judgments about mental states, things happening within me. And they're really not judgments about how that stuff might relate to something else. All of that, I'm suggesting, fits quite well with the way in which Kant actually talks about the space that's in the intuition. It is ordering subjective elements, sensations, and the consciousness of the intuition and perception would be the consciousness of sensations ordered as to the space of the intuition in which they belong. Okay, so that's an initial conclusion about what is the space of intuition and how would it relate to what we could call the consciousness of space in mere perception. Now, none of this would be especially motivated if we couldn't connect it eventually to Kant's discussion of experience. Now, I think it's very common to think the same objects that are given in intuition and we become conscious of perception, and in perception, if people even draw that distinction, it must be the very same objects that we're judging about in experience. And now note, however, that we've already seen Kant himself distinguishing between sensations and intuition itself, and that of which we're conscious in perception, and then some other object that we are determining through perception, intuition, appearance, etc., and becoming having empirical cognition of in experience. And so it looks like, at least on the face of it, that experience moves us to a different object of which we're conscious, not the sensation itself or the sensation ordered within the space of intuition, as we might become conscious of in perception, that this, red is next to blue in my visual field, or however we might want to describe it. But, we're making a judgment about a flower or a boat or some physical substance, the object that we're cognizing by way of having intuition, synthesizing them in perception, and then eventually making judgments about in experience. So that's at least suggested by the material so far. Now, if the hypothesis that I've suggested about space were true, then we should see Kant, when he eventually talks about space in relation to experience, making some kind of distinction between not just the object that we judge about in experience, but is it in space? It can't be in the same space that we were talking about in the aesthetic, because that's occupied by sensations, if this reading is right. So is there a second space where the physical bodies are, where the boats are, where the roses are? And does he show any indication of having that second sense? What I would like to suggest is very early on in the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, where he takes up the question of space in relation to not just intuition, but to experience, we can see that he seems to be aware of that he is drawing a distinction here. And we can walk through the text of the early parts of this discussion and this work and begin to get the hang of how he wants to describe this distinction. Okay, so this is very early on in the first main section, one of the first explications that he gives, and then one of the first remarks that he gives to that explication. So here we're talking not just about space, but about matter. And so if we want to ask about matter, how do we talk about it? Well, let's go stepwise through talking about matter. How do we talk about it? Well, first, we want to talk about not just how it would belong to itself as an object, but by relation to however the representation of matter could first be given to me. And when we do it that way, then we want to describe every object of the outer senses as matter. So first step, go from matter as an object to the representation of matter. How is this given, this first representation, or the representations out of which we can get to matter? The objects of the outer senses, that will be the first thing. Now, outer sense and outer senses, we know will be that out of which outer intuitions arise. And so we're wondering, will space be relevant for the discussion of matter? Yes, of course. Space, now note it gets introduced, but however, space would, however, merely be the form of all outer sensible intuition. And so we would want to note that the space is distinct from whatever we're talking about with matter, insofar as space, the first space that we talk about, is just the form of the outer sensible intuition of the representations, and not yet the form of the matter itself or the objects that might be out there relating to the outer senses. And so we're leaving open whether this form, you can see in the parentheses, does this form also belong to the outer object that we call matter, or does it just remain in our sense? So there's if I do pen, okay, well, let me do pen. Okay. Sorry. Well, I'm not, let's see, can I do, here, pen, sorry. So here we're talking about matter, but here we're talking about space, and we're saying of space, it's the form of intuition. That's what we know and love from the aesthetic. But we're also bracketing, we're leaving completely aside, whether this form also belongs in itself to the object that we call matter. Okay, so now we see Kant having a question, even within the doctrine of intuition, should we think of space just as the form of the intuition, or is there some way in which space belongs to the outer object? Now, as you could suspect, I want to note that, well, that matters, that he's at least pausing there. So then what is matter itself? Well, matter itself, as opposed to the form, would be that in the outer intuition, which is an object of sensation, so not sensation, but the object of sensation, and the properly empirical element of sensible and outer intuition, it can in no way be given a priori. Okay, so we knew that matter is an empirical, something that can only be given a posteriori. And then when we finally get a discussion of experience itself, so here we're no longer just talking about intuition, but in experience, we have something that's sensed, so something that's related to intuition, and also the space in which we arrange our experience must also be sensible. So when we move now to experience, it's a quick shift, but we have from the discussion of intuition that there's a form that is called space, and then there's something in relation to intuition, which is the correlate of the sensations which are in intuition, so the object of sensation. Notice that term. Matter here is being described as the object of sensation, so not just the sensation itself. So we're distinguishing in relation to intuition, space, and then matter as not really being the matter of the intuition itself, the sensations, but instead the object of the sensations. When we move to experience, we see that there's going to be a similar distinction. There's something sensed, or the real, the matter in that sense. But then there's also the space, this new thing, in which we arrange our experience. Now notice, it must also be sensible, and it itself must also be an object of experience. But note now what we're calling this space, empirical space, and that this, as material, is itself movable, and that it is a movable space. Now, just this enumeration of features, that the space that will pertain to experience is something that arranges experience and not intuition. It arranges experience of motion, which would include also time, which we'll just pause for a second and note. But that this space will be also sensible, that maybe that's not so different from the space of intuition, but also that it will be an object of experience. And so now we're signaling it's not the form of an intuition, but it's the object that's cognized through an experience. Not just that, it's empirical, it itself. Now there we see a clear contrast with the space of the aesthetic, which we know is not empirical, but is pure. And not only that, it's material, which we now know, okay, even if it allows experience to be arranged in some sense, and so is kind of like a form or an order, it is also material, and it is also movable, this thing that we're calling space and experience. And we want to talk about it as a movable space. Okay, so that's an enumeration of features early on in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, with Kant marking a distinction between the way in which we would talk about space when we talk about it in intuition, and the way in which we talk about space when we're talking about it in relation to the matter that will be the material in the objects of experience. When we talk about space in relation to the objects of experience, we're talking about something that is itself an object of experience, something that is itself empirical, something that is itself movable, and something that is therefore not given a priori, not pure, and not merely a form. So I think just from this short passage alone, we already can have the sense that Kant early on in this work, which is dealing with the space that is related to the experience of physical objects and the space in which the physical objects are, ascribing to that space different properties than the space that he ascribes to the space in intuition, or the space merely of appearances, or the space of the sensations that we saw in the aesthetic. Now here, again, we can see Kant wanting to talk about making the motion of a body into an experience. And then there's some certain kinds of conditions. We need to be able to see, again, I just want to highlight this just so you can see the contrast. In experience, what we need, not only the body is an object of outer experience and material, but also the space itself. is also an object of experience and material. And then note what he's contrasting: an absolute motion in relation to some, what we might have thought, oh wait, that just is the space of intuition, non-material space, that cannot be experienced at all, and is even nothing for us. Okay, so not only does it look like we have a distinction between the space in intuition and this empirical space that's given in an experience across a bunch of different properties, it looks like we have in this remark that's just a few pages later, a kind of contrast with if we were trying to think of the objects of experience in relation to the non-material space of pure intuition, we can't experience a motion in relation to that. Motion is always going to be relative to the movable space itself, which is the empirical space, etc. Okay, so as you could see, the discussion of absolute space was tracking over into a still further space. I'm just going to note that the exits, the door to go off into the next discussion is there, but move on just to conclude so that we can have time for discussion. Okay, so what does this teach us, just to try to get to the theme of the Congress, about Kant's idealism? So, it's well known, of course, that in the aesthetic, one of the first, in the whole work, one of the first places where transcendental idealism by name gets mentioned is in relation to space and time, and the affirmation that space is transcendentally ideal, time is transcendentally ideal. And so there's no good interpretation of Kant according to which the space of intuition is not something which should be said to be transcendentally ideal. And so nothing in what I'm trying to present will speak against that or try to pull us back from fully accepting that the space in intuition is transcendentally ideal. What I do want to raise the question about, though, is how should we describe the space that, if I'm right, the space of physical objects, the space of of bodies, the space which is itself material, the space which is itself movable, which orders our experiences and doesn't just order the sensations in our intuition. What should we say about that space? Is that space ideal, or is it, and if it has ideal elements, is it ideal in the same respect? So that's the key question for the conclusion that I'd like to end with. So again, just to remind you, when we get to the expositions, we see the reality of space in regard to everything that can become before us externally as an object. And so in that sense, it has validity over and against, in some sense, what we can have as objects externally, but at the same time, an ideality of space in regard to things when they are considered in themselves or through reason, or without taking account of the constitution of our sensibility. So, and note, we assert the empirical reality of space with respect to all possible outer experience. This is one of the few places where he's talking about experience. Though, to be sure, it's transcendental ideality when we leave aside its relation to experience and ask, does it relate to things in themselves? So just in this passage, I know people have read this many times. I'm inviting you to hear it in a slightly different way, that the reality of space comes from the relation between the space in intuition and the space that's in experience, that there's some way we can show, maybe it's through the principles in the first critique or in the metaphysical foundations themselves, there's an agreement of some sort, law-like or lawful, that we can exposit between the space that is immediately present in our intuition and something that we will call space and judge about as space in the objects of experience, as an object of experience itself. For that reason, even though the thing that's in intuition is merely a representation, it's merely in us, it doesn't belong to the things in themselves, it doesn't technically even itself belong to, it's not identical with the space that organizes the objects of experience, this space will still have a kind of reality insofar as it points us to, in cognitively significant ways, what the space is of the things that is in outer experience, that are in outer experience. So from the transcendental point of view, the space and intuition is still merely ideal, but when we think about it in relation to the objects of experience, it gains a reality by virtue of being related to that space in the relation of application or determination by the understanding. Now, what exactly is that relation? That's going to be the big question that we'll end with. I do just want to note that in the Prolegomena, I wanted to apologize also about the quotes from the Metaphysical Foundations. I didn't have an electronic copy of the Metaphysical Foundations in translation in Spanish, and so I hope someone else can find those passages and make sure that the translation works, and the points that I'm making aren't lost in just the English and German, but they also show up in Spanish. Anyways, but here, this one last quote from the Prolegomena, I want to note, what's interesting here, this is in the note to part 1, note number 2. He wants to know, okay, so how would I get out of saying something is ideal? I would have to make this very extreme assertion. I would have to say, so let's get this distinction. In order for there to be no idealism, I would have to say not only that space is perfectly in accordance with the relation that our sensibility has to objects. I've already said that. So there's a kind of agreement between our representation of space and the relation that our sensibility has to its objects. But I'd have to say more than that the representation of space is even fully similar to the object. Now here, that one doesn't make any sense to him. But note, he's not denying that the representation of space that we have in intuition doesn't have some agreement with, or doesn't stand in accordance with, the relation that our sensibility has to its objects. And so what I'm suggesting is there's something in the representation of space, which, though it's merely ideal, does point us to how sensibility in general is related to the objects in experience. And so there is an accordance that we can read off of the structure of space and intuition and apply it to the objects of experience without ever saying that it's fully like the structure or the order of the objects in experience itself. And so with that, I would at least suggest that this path is not only just open, but there's actually some evidence and stations along the way for taking the path, for ascribing to Kant a view that's very similar to the one that we started with in the early parts of the text, that there is a sense of space which goes with the sense that's contained in intuition, but that sense exists only in our representations and order sensations, whereas there's a different space, what we would now call empirical space in Kant's sense, which is not pure, but empirical, which is not merely a form, but itself is material, which is not in our representation, but the order of the material substances themselves, and is the space that is determined through physics, not just the space that would be the subject matter of psychological investigation or the metaphysical exposition in the first critique. Okay, so with that, I'll end. Thank you all for listening. Apologies again that there wasn't more Spanish in the discussion between the group of us that are here. Please feel free to ask your questions in Spanish if that would be easier for you. I will respond most likely in English, but we'll make sure that we all understand and can come together on what we're trying to talk about. Okay, so thanks so much. I'll stop the sharing.
Thank you, Clinton. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I don't know if anybody else, well, Addison or anybody else want to ask something to Clinton. Okay, Julia, Addison, could you please
Ahora
start?
Addison primero.
Yeah.
No, Addison first. Yeah.
I was gonna say that.
Yeah.
last time he gave you the chance. Now, Addison, please.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the great talk, Clinton. I think my question. I guess I have two questions, and I think the first one is probably really flat-footed and maybe a dumb question, but so yeah, I'm not sure. So let me just ask. Let me ask my second question, and then I'll see if I still have a question. So I'm wondering what the unity of these spaces is, right? So I mean, and I'm wondering what the unity of the space is consistent, in particular with regard to a kind of act, presumably, well, either an act of either a sensible act or an act of judgment or what, right? So what grounds the unity of these spaces? It seems to me, I mean, the way that I might approach this, if you just asked me, like, what is sort of the unifying conception of space in Kant, I would look to sort of the discussion of space in the conclusions from the above concepts, right? In the Transcendental Aesthetic, where Kant's talking about, he just talks about space, right? He doesn't qualify it with anything there. He just says space is nothing other than the mere form of blah blah blah, and so on, right? So that's one question: is there a particular sort of form of space that you've discussed here that provides for this unity? I guess the other question I had was just about, this is the flat-footed dumb question. So in the Aesthetic, Kant says that when he asserts the empirical reality of space, we also assert the transcendental ideality of it. And I mean, the way he presents it is not as though there's any room for an opposition between ideality and empirical reality, but that they're originally unified, that the ideality is also real, or, you know, the reality is also ideal. Do you think that's just the wrong way of approaching that? Or yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Addison. So maybe I'll do the second one first, just because it's a little bit more straightforward. But so I was suggesting that we're talking only about the space that's in intuition and order sensations, and saying of it that it has no existence unto itself, but the existence that it has in our representations. And so in that very straightforward sense, it's ideal, it's not substantial. It's just, it only exists insofar as there are representations. But we want to say about that very same space that it stands in a relation to this other thing, which is the objects of experience and the order of the objects of experience, and what will eventually be called empirical space. And that it allows us to reason about the other space, the space where the bodies are and physics is investigating. And it takes, some philosophical work to show that this space has that connection to that reality. But because it has that connection, there's another very straightforward sense in which it inherits a reality unto itself that, just like, just the general question of the applicability of mathematics more across the board, that, 1, 2, 3 numbering isn't just a game, but it can also have reality insofar as it's put in coordination with physical things. It can have physical significance in that sense. I think throughout the critique, we can see Kant at various places, especially in the principles, talking about the reality that mathematics itself has as dependent on the possibility of demonstrating the applicability of its content over and against the objects of experience. And so what I'm just trying to point up is the reality that we ascribe to space itself depends on its being able to be shown to be in coordination with the objects of experience. It's not like it out of itself has reality unto itself, just like in the discussion in the B edition of the deduction, Kant seems to say that mathematical reasoning and concepts are not genuinely cognitions until they're shown to have application to the objects in experience and empirical reality itself. So that was that point. And yeah, I don't want to say there's an opposition, but I do want to say that in regard to a skeptic who might allow that there is phenomenal space or space that's in the appearance or in the intuition, and maybe even allow that, and this is a little bit the way that Strawson goes, we could reason about that space and trace out its features and maybe even form axioms and demonstrate and prove things by doing imaginary drawing in that imaginary physical or phenomenal space, there would still be this open question of what does it have to do with the real world, and how does it relate to the real world, the world of physics? And so that step has to be closed. And until we can close that step, we might say, oh, this whole space is just imaginary. It doesn't bear any relation to what's real. And so it can't tell us anything about what's real. It doesn't constrain what's real. It gives us no information about what's real. And so not only does it only exist in the imagination or in intuition, but it is of no help in learning about what's real. And so that step, I want to insist Kant takes seriously. And it's precisely because there's a gap between the space and intuition and the order of experience that he feels the pressure to actually give some kind of account there. So that was on that second point. But on the first one, it's a harder question in part because, so there's two aspects. One is if it's right that there's the space in intuition and the space of experience as the order of the objects of experience, then we could ask about each of them. Do they have a unity? And if they do, what gives the unity to it? Now, I think with respect to the space and intuition, it looks like it just is asserted that it's given as unified. That space, the space and intuition, it's einig. It has, the features of including all other spaces of its kind. That's just in the metaphysical exposition. So in the space of intuition, it is one. It has its own unity per se. When we move to the space of experience, however, I think it's much less clear that we can prove of it that it has a unity. It obviously has connectedness, but I didn't get to it in section 5, but the idea of the absolute space that would be the collective unity of all of these movable spaces in some single thing, which is the idea of the unity of empirical space, is not an idea or it's not a concept that's the object of it, that has its object in experience, but it's an idea. It's an idea we use. Maybe it's necessary to do science, but it's not an idea whose object we can demonstrate exists in experience. And so I think it's a real question if Kant thinks that in the same sense that the space of intuition is one and singular and connected and has the features that we see in the aesthetic, which of those can we carry over to the space of physics? And which of those can we carry over not just in thought through reasoning, but which can we demonstrate and prove through the application of mathematics or through whatever the procedure and the metaphysical foundations of natural science are? And so some of the features we can prove, but I think it's a real question, is it all of those features? Which features might not be ones that we can know a priori obtain in relation to physical space? Now, just the last little point, is there some unity that obtains between the space of intuition and physical space? Are those two unified in some other space? And there, I think it's in some ways a category mistake in Kant's own presentation, that I don't think he thinks the space of intuition itself is somewhere in physical space. It's just it's like thoughts are nowhere in physical space. The space in intuition is like a concept in a thought. It exists in something. It has an order, but the thing in which it exists is nowhere in the space that is physical. And so I don't think they form a unity in the sense of they're both in some one space. They stand in a kind of, as he puts it at the end of the prolegomena of that quote, the end of the presentation, the space in intuition is in accordance with or corresponds to the relation to outer objects in experience, but it doesn't relate to it by either being identical with it or by being a part of some still larger whole. It's more like a sign relation, that it encodes information about it that we can reason about, but it's not because it belongs in it or it's a small part of it, or my space of intuition is just really small piece of the general physical object space. I think it's just a different kind of relationship than being one in the way that some people might think. You can, a simple way of putting this is, if you're thinking about the space that you experience when you're dreaming, it's a good question, like where is that in relation to, the actual biblioteca ad unam? How far away is it? Like, is it in the same time? It just feels like there's a relation, but it's not by being one with it. It's some other strange, very interesting, very dramatic in that particular case relationship, but will it be a relationship of oneness? Maybe they could both belong in the same thought or something, but they're not going to be spatially together. I don't know, Addison, if any of that was in the direction of your question, but
yeah. So actually, what you were just saying was really interesting, because I wasn't thinking of it exactly in that way, and so that's something, that's another interesting point. I think what I was wondering was what is it about these different forms of space, if we can call them different forms, that makes them each a kind of space, right? I mean, so what is it that unifies them as a conception of, I mean, so that's, I guess, the question I was, and you don't have to answer that now. I mean, we can move on and we could talk about it later, but I think what I'm wondering is really like, what I guess the question is, what is the essence of space, right? I mean, what is it that makes any of these spaces space, and what is the sort of overarching conception of space that applies to all of them? And can we locate that in one of them as a kind of ground of the others, or are these just sort of family resemblance, forms? Or
yeah. Also, I see Manuel's question. Gracias, Manuel. I mean, it's not a simple question at all, but how many spaces are there? Should we categorize? And then, are there principles for unifying them or looking for the unity of these distinct spaces? Similar kind of question. I guess I would say, so in both the Leibnizian tradition and then later in the Carnapian tradition, there is a more abstract conception of space that we could articulate merely by way of the categories of the understanding, having to do with an order of coexistence, where we don't add any intuitive spatial features or any intuitive temporal features, and we just talk about order of coexistence of substantialities, or even just of coexistence, we don't even say of what. And there, if it's a merely logical conception of space, we could see that as providing the form that something must have if it is to be a space. And then we see intuitive space, phenomenal space, perceptual space as a case of it. It is an order of coexistence of sensations. And so we add the further feature of sensation. And then we also, in order to see what that space is like, we have to have the intuition of it. And so experience, in that thin sense of experience, that we can't deduce its features a priori. We need to, at least have the pure intuition. Or sorry, we can't deduce its features a priori merely from concepts. We have to have some kind of intuitive representation of it. But there's a still further space, which would be the order of coexistence, not of sensations, but specifically of substances. And that would be even more another kind of specification. And then from there, we could split between the order of coexistence of substances that relate to us in our sensibility by causing sensations in us, and that order of coexistence of those substances that give sensations to us and we judge about in experience, I think will be the order of coexistence of substances that we'll call physical space. Now, the Leibnizian more broad conception of the order of coexistence of all substances, even if they don't seem to causally engage with our sensations, although with Leibniz, it's tricky, there might be universal causal interactivity. So every substance will also be in the order of physical in Kant's sense. At least, if there's the divine substance, is the divine because we're distinct from the divine? Should we think of that? Is there an order of coexisting, and should space apply to that case? Depending on what you mean by space, it might, in the intuitive sense, phenomenal sense, definitely not. God isn't in the space of sensations. I think in the physical sense too, God isn't in the order of physical substances. That seems fairly straightforward. But is there some abstract conception of space where we want to describe our relationship as being in him, and also that we exist simultaneously or in some order of non-temporality, but somewhere we exist in God's understanding? We start using in language. Could we give a logical spatial description that would allow it to be spatial, but not in the more specific senses? I'm open to that. I don't know. I think Kant, when he uses the term space, he just thinks the first thing we mean by it is really the immediate intuitive one, and everything else is like a construction or abstraction or whatever. And so maybe we could reason our way to order of coexistence per se, where we don't say anything about the sensory feel of it, But that might look more like some logical category, or I don't know.
Mm.
I don't know if that's helpful, but
Julia, tu duda, ¿querías comentar algo?
Well,
Julia Julia, y tenemos por ahí una duda en el chat, pero primero Julia, adelante.
well, I'll try to be very brief because I'm still like grasping everything, like all the distinctions. But I was wondering. I have two questions. The first one is if I understood correctly the distinction between the space as in the transcendental aesthetic, sorry, and the empirical space is, if I understood correctly, a distinction between an ideal space and a real space. I mean, if so, what worries me is what implications could that have in what ideal means in Kant, especially in the context of prolegomena that you cited, because he's trying to distinguish himself from Berkeley, if I remember correctly, and he's saying no. I mean, it's ideal, but it's also my transcendental idealism has also this realist part. Is not like Berkeley is not an ideal space in that sense. So I'm not making a space just a mere thing in my head, like a mental state. So if I understood correctly your distinction, how could we distinguish that space from the transcendental aesthetic from Berkeley, as Kant wants to do it in Prolegomena? And the second one is I like the strategy of reading these like stairs from intuition to perception to experience, but that distinction for me, it's a conceptual distinction in also alluding to what Addison and Manuel were asking about the unity of space, right? And you quoted the part where Kant says space cannot be a concept because of the unity it has, because of the particular unity it has. So I was just wondering, if we talk about space in perception and space in experience and this empirical space, wouldn't that be just a matter of distinguishing conceptual unities we can track in experience, but not a distinction in the space that's given? I don't know if I'm being clear with that, but that would be my question. Because when you say perception is an intuition with consciousness, what brings consciousness is categories, like this synthesis, like a conceptual background in which I have intuitions, and that's why I'm conscious of it. So I don't know if we could just say it's a conceptual distinction, but not a distinct space from the one in the aesthetic. So that would be it.
Yeah, thank you. And then maybe also I'll talk about the Luciana's question after, if that's okay, Carlos. But so yes, on the first point, so I wanted to have that last quote from the Prolegomena exactly for the reason that you were bringing up, Julia, is it's not only that Kant is not a mere phenomenalist insofar as he doesn't think that the only things that exist are appearances. He thinks there are substances with powers, and maybe our own thinking substance is one. But he's also not idealism in the sense, he's not an idealist in the sense that he describes Berkeley as being an idealist, because there he describes that as the claim that not just there are only appearances, but the only things that exist are thinking things. And so in distinction from that kind of idealism, which is not a mere phenomenalism, but is a spiritual idealism, describe it as that way, or a thinking idealism, I think it's striking that he does want to allow, at least in the presentation, that not only are there appearances, and then are there spiritual beings that have them, and so the thinking subject that has the appearances in them, and not only might there be other thinking substances which might cause appearances in each other, maybe that's Berkeley's idea of spirits moving and causing ideas in each other. But I think he really does want to say, in relation to the actual existence of outer things, which are not themselves spirits, that those things exist, and that the spatial representation in us bears some relationship of agreement to how we relate to them. And so what you were bringing up exactly on the Berkeleyan picture is there's nothing in the representation of space in our idea that corresponds to anything in the realm of spirits. And so it's merely in our idea, and it has no connection. There's nothing we can reason from about the distinctions in space to distinctions in the realm of what is actually real. At least that's the way Kant, I think, is reading Berkeley. On the presentation that I was giving of Kant's views, that's not true. One, because there are things he's allowing, I think, besides spirits that exist outside of us and cause sensations in us. So at least in principle, there's merely material things. Not everything is spiritual. But more importantly, the spatial distribution of sensations in us is something that we can use to reason about the distribution of the powers outside of us. And so the actual existence of outer things, this is how he describes it, we don't deny that things that are outside of us really are outer and causing things in us. And we also don't deny that something about the way that they affect us or cause ideas in us, and not just that there are ideas, but the distribution of them, the form of their arrangement, also stands in a relationship to the way in which they're outside of us. That those things together add up to something more than what he thinks Berkeley can say. So he doesn't think he has to say that he's an idealist in the specific sense of there are only appearances, or there are only appearances plus spirits, and the parts of the appearances that look like they're about spatial externality have nothing to do with the spiritual world. Both the parts of spatial representations do have something to do with the distribution and difference in the realm of powers. And then also, I think he's at least open to the possibility that not everything that has powers is itself a spirit that's causing sensations in us. So there might be non-spiritual, merely body things, maybe, I don't know. But that's a harder metaphysical question that maybe he takes up later. About the second point, yeah, I mean, that's a nice way to put the question. And I think this is part of what, maybe when people are reading in the critique, they think, he says space here, this is the only thing that space can mean. Everything else has to come from this meaning of space. And whenever we say space, we have to come back to this one. And that's really all that space means. There's only that one space. No other thing could be space. That's not an uncommon way of talking about Kant's views. I guess, so part of the presentation that draws to the predecessors and to the successors is to note that within the context, both people who influence Kant and people who claim to be influenced by Kant, they accept that there are different things you can mean by space. And so it's unfair to say to them, those meanings can't possibly mean anything because this is the only thing someone can mean by space. That's just step one. But step two, and I think this is a part of Addison's question and also Manuel's in the chat, is it's not just we call two things space, but they have nothing to do with each other. There is a core definition of space that we could see being instantiated in the thing that we're immediately given through our intuition, but then also through the thing that we reason about and judge about in experience, and then also possibly through this larger order of coexistence that maybe we can only reason about and we can't experience at all. Should those be called space? I think, if we're going to call the first thing space, the space in intuition, is the only thing that we can call space. I guess I don't see what the motivation for that is, either within the period or philosophically, or I do think what he is arguing about there is the space that pertains to our sense. And so it's already given the context, we're talking about sensibility, and then in section 1, we're talking about the effects on our sensibility through affection and sensation, and then the structure of an appearance and intuition, and the idea that there might be forms and matters of those. And so that's the setup, that's the subject matter we're talking about. And then we're noting within all of that, there's something in it that we'll call space. Now, using the term space or Raum, or Ausdehnung or Gestalt, or there's a bunch of terms that are in the neighborhood here, to pick out something within sense, within the form of sense that orders sensations, I think he's on good grounds that we do use the term space to refer to that order. But I don't think he's arguing that that's the only thing that we could use the term space to mean. And partly that was part of the evidence from the metaphysical foundations is I think he himself thinks we can use the term space to mean an order of material that isn't itself immediately given a priori in a pure form. He doesn't say, oh, this is only space-like, or we shouldn't use the word space, we should use some other word. And my sense is that that's just in keeping with the period that, yes, there's physical space is totally a space. When we start from, in the critique, the order of the elements by looking at the mental capacities, and in there we find something that's space, that's a very specific space. That's a different way to put the point. I don't know if that addresses the two questions that you were asking about in a way that will be helpful, or but if you want to ask a follow-up, that's totally fine.
No.
Thank you, Julia. Just the questions from Luciana Clinton, if you can address a little bit.
Yes, I mean, this is also a really excellent question. So the space that's given immediately in intuition, that is the subject matter of the aesthetic, it obviously bears a relationship to the space of the objects in experience. That was the main distinction I was trying to draw. But then there's this second in-between topic, which is not the space of intuition as it's given immediately, but I think that same space, but now as it's thought about through, by way of tracing with the imagination, actually just drawing in imagination, and reasoning about the drawings or shapes that are depicted. And so this is where I think, again, this goes back a little bit to Addison's question about, is there a unity between the space of intuition and experience?
Mm-hmm.
You could allow that the space of intuition is the proper subject matter of geometry, and that the methodology of investigating the space of intuition is the geometrical method, or however you do the method of discovery in geometry, and then have that be one scene. That's Act 1. Now, Act 2, what does that have to do with experience at all, and physics and nature? Is there a triangle in nature at all? Are there circles in nature at all? Are there numbers in nature at all? Why, is there numerical difference in nature at all? And I think a lot of the ways that the critique gets read, it can be as if, oh, we say something about space in the aesthetic, and then we get for free that, of course, it's all going to apply to experience, and it's all the same space, and there's no real question here. We already know every object of the senses is an object of experience, and so the space applies to the object of the senses and also applies to the objects of experience. Geometry applies to the objects of the senses, so it must apply to the objects of experience. What I'm trying to insist on is there's a gap here. It's a big step, and that Kant signals that there's a gap here at various places. And so it's within the space of his system to say the subject matter of geometry proper is the space that's given in intuition, and the operations by which we investigate that space is by way of imagination and thinking and reasoning and constructing. And then we need a philosophical argument or demonstration that any of that investigation has applicability to physical objects, and that's just a second step. And so I think exactly as you were bringing up, within the aesthetic, the conclusions that are drawn about the transcendental significance of the exposition of space in intuition point immediately to geometry. And I was noting they do eventually say something about experience, and that if experience were possible, it would also depend on this space being there and that space being a certain way. Exactly how, we don't know. But if you notice exactly the place that you looked, in the axioms and in the beginning of the principles, and then also in the deduction itself, Kant, I think, fairly directly confronts the possibility that mathematical concepts and mathematics as a discipline, a set of propositions, axioms, demonstrations, it needs a philosophical demonstration of its validity with respect to the objects of experience, with respect to its own claim to cognize those same objects a priori. And so the principles in the axioms of intuition would be one step into showing how the mathematical domain can be put in relation to the physical domain. And so, that it's a second step and isn't just already entailed by the aesthetic, I think is part of the same spirit of the reading, that there's really two steps here. And so the other last thing just to note about the axioms of intuition and even the anticipations of perception, unlike the analogies, is that with respect to extensive magnitude in space, it seems like it's neutral whether you're talking about the space of intuition or the space of physical objects, in a way that it's not neutral by the time you get to the analogies and you're talking explicitly about experience, that you're talking about substances that don't belong within any one perception or in any one intuition, but unify perceptions across a bunch by being their common ground, or all the cause by unifying perceptions necessarily across one another. And so if you go back and look at the passages in the analogies, it's very insistent that none of the subject matter, cause, substance, community already exists in intuition or even in perception. There's a series of perceptions that we cognize substances and causes through, but that happens in this whole other step, experience. In the axioms and anticipations, we're not to that step yet. So it's a little bit, it's on the way, but it's not yet the doctrine of experience proper. That's another piece of the interpretive position. I don't know if that's directly on what you were asking about, Luciana, but it's a great question.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking also about the problem of understanding at the same time the idea that the intuition of space is prior to its elements, which is stated on point 3, principally on point 3 of the metaphysical exposition of space. And then when Kant talks about the extensive magnitude and says that everything is like an extensive quantity or magnitude, and also space, it seems there seems to be a contradiction between the metaphysical exposition and the axioms of intuition. So that I was wondering if this distinction you mentioned is helpful to understand how Kant solves this difficulty.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's a nice way to clarify the question. And maybe you will already anticipate or guess that in geometry, there's no question about that which fills the magnitude of space. But already in the anticipations and even in the axioms, there's at least a mentioning of sensation as that which fills. And so in the extensive case, it fills it qualitatively in some way or other. And then in the intensive case, it fills it as to a certain degree of magnitude of intensity. And so I would think that in geometry, and maybe even metaphysics before we start doing geometry, when we look at the space in intuition, we see, the whole, that its whole precedes any parts that we find in it, that it's all one, that it's indefinite, that it has, it's not bounded anywhere in itself, all the features that are in the exposition, that it has to be given an intuition rather than reasoned about through a concept. All of that is present. And then when we get to the axioms, we're already thinking about that same space, but now being put in relation to more things. First, the sensations that fill it. And then as to extensive magnitude fillings and intensive magnitude fillings. And then in the analogies, we're thinking about that whole space, the space of intuition being filled with sensations. How are those fillings connected to something outside of the intuition? So what's the real, not that's in the sensation, but that's the object of the sensation? What's the real that's the object of the extensive magnitude in the intuition? Well, it's something that we'll also say has extension, but now it's in the physical sense. And so can we start building the bridge towards the objects of experience? By the time we get to substance and cause, we're all the way over there. There are no substances or causes within the mathematical. I think that's another way to think about, you're making your steps, but you're not quite there. Carlos, did you want to ask something, or were you just wanting to cut me off?
No. I was just gonna say that I don't know. We have time for one last question. I would like to say, this reading you are making of Kant and distinguishing two kinds of space. which is really interesting for me, I guess, and for the whole topic of this charge of idealism to Kant, which was made by Garvey, Feather and Garvey, the review. This is my question. Does this reading support a phenomenalist reading of Kant? And also how this helps to save Kant from that charge of idealism, if he thinks that the space is something outside, because I think that's one of the main critiques, because he makes a space something in us, then it's not real with the objects and etc. Right? So that would be my question. This reading, if it's a phenomenalist Kant, and also how does this help to save Kant from that charge of idealism? I would like to say that, and don't worry, you have time. We have time.
Yeah. Great. Okay, I will try to be quick though. So I just on the phenomenalism point. So I at the beginning of the presentation, I was trying to be careful by saying what I want to endorse is something that looks like a phenomenalist reading of Kant, but specifically about what he means by appearance, or that which is contained inside of an intuition, that which is transcendently ideal. And so those things, he says it 1,000 times that those only exist inside of representations. Those, if we took away representations, those wouldn't be there. It looks like they're made up of sensations or features like sensations. I don't really see the motivation for trying to deny that he says that and he means that about that specific subject matter, the appearances. And so phenomenalism in the 19th and 20th century versions can look like a further development of Kant's views on appearances. Now, if you notice, though, exactly you were picking up on this, that what I want to draw a sharp distinction already in Kant is the distinction between the appearances and the physical objects, the substances. And so appearances will be made up of, in a kind of literal way, sensations or representational pieces. Physical substances will not be made up of sensations. They'll be the ground of the sensations. They'll be the causes of sensations. They'll have properties in them that correspond to the qualitative differentiation in our sensations, but they aren't themselves made up of sensations or mental states. And so in that specific sense, Kant is not a phenomenalist about physical objects, bodies, physical substances. And so that distinction in kinds of spaces also helps us see that we can accept the things that people get so worried about in Kant about appearances without assigning to Kant a thoroughgoing phenomenalism. And so people like Bertrand Russell or even Carnap have constitution projects where they think, okay, yes, what's given first is something like an intuition and sensations and sense data, et cetera. But then we also have powers of reasoning and operations and constructions, whatever. When we construct to be able to judge about physical objects, it's so clear that we're not judging about these sense data. We're judging about something else. Now, there's an epistemic question. Can we know anything about that something else? But what there is no question about is what we're judging about. It's not identical with any sense datum or even collection of sense data. And so what I want to say is for Kant, too, when we judge about the contents of intuition by way of perception, or in the special case in geometry, looking at the space and intuition and reasoning about it, we're judging about one thing. When we judge about physical objects, we're judging about a second thing. And the one doesn't make up the other, even though they're in a relationship with the other. So Kant would be a phenomenalist about appearances, but a realist about physical bodies, substances. And so that would be the way I would try to split the difference. So that idealism becomes, maybe less dramatic because it's more a psychological point, but maybe that's not so bad because it makes Kant into someone that we feel like we don't have to make apologies for all the time.
Okay.
So anyways, but thank you for the question.
No, I think it's very interesting and it helps me a lot with my project, and I like the distinction between two kinds of spaces. Well, thank you, Clinton, and it's been a pleasure.